If you have made yourself indispensable in your role, that is an almost impossible place to be because they can't replicate you. It's very expensive in terms of time to attempt to move you. So we'll just keep you where you are. You're doing a good job. Keep doing what you're doing, right? We're getting what you need from you, but you have boxed yourself into this corner unknowingly.
Melody, have you seen that's almost like an 80-20, that if they do that, really it can help them manage their boss and control their own future and pathway? What have you seen that's really, really working?
Ironically, I'm going to go with the boundaries conversation.
Mm,
This is the one that I often find myself talking about the most. And why I say this is an area for that 80-20 is because people often make the mistake of thinking that if they are the workhorse and they put in all the effort, that is what will help them advance. And people come to me all the time saying, I have been busting my butt. I've been taking on more projects and I've been, pinch hitting on these other initiatives where teams needed support. And now I'm doing the role of 2, 3 people after we've reorged and moved roles around.
hmm
I'm being told in my performance reviews that I'm not strategic enough or that I don't know how to prioritize. And that's what happens when you don't have the boundaries conversation, is that you are seen as the doer and the executor and the reliable workhorse, but you are not seen as someone who has the leadership quality of being able to push back and make tough judgment calls and have hard conversations when they are needed. And so that's why I say the boundaries conversation, it's a scary one and often an unpleasant one, but it's probably one of the most common ones that you need to have because it just comes up so frequently.
But Melody, that's so huge, though. Just to interrupt you there, as you were saying that, I think a lot of listeners, like myself included, have found ourselves in those situations before, where you're doing all these things. But then the crazy thing is, like what you just said, the leader views you saying yes to everything as not being in a leadership sort of strategic mindset. I mean, it's so hard to hear, but it's so true. If we were sitting in the boss's chair, maybe you could help us see it from their perspective. What are they actually seeing? Like, why is it so bad to just say yes, to work midnights, weekends, pick up the phone every, whatever time it is? Why is it so bad?
Well, what they are seeing is that, yes, you are reliable and you're dedicated. They know that you can do the work. They're not fully confident that you can lead the work. They're not fully confident that you can be directive enough with other people to say, hey, we need this or we need that. No, we're not doing this. We're not doing that. And what they don't see that you have the ability to prioritize. When everything is important, nothing is important. And the last thing is also, ironically, the calculus that a leader is running through is, well, if I promote Howie, how hard is it going to be to replace him in his role? And if you have made yourself indispensable in your role, that is an almost impossible place to be because they can't replicate you. It's very expensive, literally, and in terms of time to attempt to move you. So we'll just keep you where you are. You're doing a good job. Keep doing what you're doing, right? We're getting what you need from you, but you have boxed yourself into this corner unknowingly.
I feel like throughout my career, working in the corporate world for 20 years, that's always the gap that you see someone moving from sort of an employee, individual contributor to like a manager or a leadership position. That's always the gap, right? It's not about doing the work. It's about having the ability and skill set to have A, difficult conversations that you talk about, and then B, prioritization. If you don't have those skills or learn those skills, you're just never going to be able to move up and be successful. This is hitting a nerve here. It's so true.
Well, and in terms of prioritization, it's not yes, it's the perception at the leadership level. It's also literally your time. And
Yeah.
you are so bogged down by the urgent, non important, death by a thousand cuts type of work, that you have no time for the more strategic work. You may have a meeting or you may have a day, for example, with back to back to back to back meetings, but none of those meetings include you getting in front of the C suite, for example, or you producing some strategy deck that's going to get circulated around. And again, this all becomes this vicious cycle of you're stuck in the lower value work. You don't have time for the higher visibility, higher value work.
All right, now let's get into it. How do you influence your man to respect those boundaries that you're trying to create for yourself? What do you do?
Yeah, there's a few strategies that I talk about in the book, and why I like to give a menu to people because not everyone is going to work in every situation. So the first one of these is what I call the conditional yes. It's
Mm,
saying, yes, I can do this in the moment, but it's setting the expectation for a boundary in the future. The psychology behind this is important. Going back to what you were saying earlier on about the fact that when we're talking about managing up, there are different status levels. We are managing up to
hmm
someone that inherently has higher positional power than us. And because of that, you have lower negotiating leverage because you are the person with lower positional authority. And so, because of that, more often than not, there are going to be situations where you kind of have to say yes to save face,
hmm
right? And to build rapport with this person and preserve your social capital. That's where the conditional yes comes in. Of you can say, yes, happy to take this on now. However, I want to point out we may not always be able to accommodate this tight of a turnaround in the future. So that's one example of that, which gives you a precedent to fall back on the next time they come asking for that. And you can say, as I've mentioned in the past, this is a situation where we can't accommodate a 24-hour turnaround. We'll have this to you by Monday. So it gives you a leg to fall back on because you set that
hmm
expectation. But the other way this can sound is, yes, we can get this done. Let's you and I sit down a week from now after we get through this busy period. I'll put some time on your calendar and we can talk about how do we get ahead of things like this in the future. Because usually a miscommunication like that is usually the result of a process or a systems gap rather more than anything else.
What as you're working with your clients, the people in your coaching cohorts, for example, have there been any like backfired or something happened? Like, I mean, that's probably a leading question, but have there been horror stories of people trying to set boundaries and it didn't work?
There have. And that usually happens when we're not paying attention to the leverage we have in a situation. So I mentioned
Mm,
that positional authority, that is one of them. You also have to be paying attention to what level of stress is this leader under? Yeah, if we're talking about this is end of year and some report is due at the end of the week before everybody else goes out of the office, or it's right before a big board meeting and your boss
mm,
is really on edge, that's probably not the time that you want to set a strong boundary. You want to be more
yeah.
flexible in that situation. Or when the organization is in a period of a lot of change or crisis. The earnings report just came out and it was terrible. Again, that's more of the time you want to read the room and build uh, you want to build social capital by being the person who is willing to step up in that situation. So that's usually where it goes wrong. One other thing I'll point out about that is also frequency of setting boundaries. If you have been setting a lot of limits around a lot of different things, you may want to be more selective about what you're setting boundaries around. If your boss is asking you, hey, can you step in for me for this meeting? I know it's at 6 p.m. and you have to pick your kids up. Would you be willing to do it this one time? And you've been saying no to a lot of other things. You want to balance the ratio of how often you are saying no as well.
Yeah, you can't just that's why like you have people that are repeating this just say no kind of thing, on LinkedIn or whatever, which is like so infuriating. Yeah, you can't just say no. In the end it's your boss, it's your manager and you're there to help them be successful. You just can't say no all the time. So that drives me crazy.
The other one that makes me angry is no is a complete sentence, which
Yeah.
in many aspects of life. Do not get me wrong. Please do not come after me on LinkedIn or Twitter. In many aspects of life, no is a complete sentence. In professional relationships, very
Mhm.
rarely should it be a complete
Yeah.
sentence. If you just imagine you asked someone for a favor and all they said to your face was no, you'd feel so off-putted. So we need to give a little bit of context behind it, and this gets into another strategy for being able to push back and say no, which is the trade off approach. So we talked about the conditional yes. The trade off is another way to go about this. And that's essentially okay, right now I'm working on X. In order to add Y, we have to temporarily slow down or pause or push out something else. I would recommend that's Z, this other project. Does that sound good? If so, I'll move ahead with that. The little bit of context you could provide is I have all of these other things on my plate. Where does this rank in terms of importance? So you're entering
Mm.
it more as a problem solving exercise and instead of just immediately throwing up a barrier, which can be perceived as you being resistant or not a team player.